Take us on a few plant rides here.
So this is my Oxalis collection. Unfortunately, it seems that they've seeded themselves and they've always been together. So it's the same one that's coming up in various pots now. So these are all South American. They're all edible. These are lilies, Lilium. This is actually almost over now, unfortunately.
Wow,
but it's a really beautiful one. And this is the species that's most cultivated for food in Japan.
Really?
Lilium auratum, or golden ray lily, I believe. And it's the bulb that's used.
Huh.
Very important food plant. Lilium davidii, David's lily, which is also cultivated and wild collected in the Far East.
How old is this plant?
In fact, this one here is probably about 15 years old.
Ah.
I bought bulbs as edible lily bulbs in a supermarket in Singapore. Brought them back to Norway, and I thought, well, I'll just put a few outside, and it turned out they were totally edible and very tasty as well. Very sweet tasting bulb.
Mine are taking time to establish. I'm guessing they like it wet.
Yeah.
Yeah, because mine, I think I put mine in the driest place in the garden, which didn't seem to work well.
It's they're also woodland plants. They don't like drying out too much. The Lilium martagon is the one that grows quickest in this climate, and it's a perfect woodland plant. Use the flowers also in salads. Look at that.
Yeah.
The pollen.
Yeah, it's a lot of people get very skeptical when I put that in a salad. Like, really? That doesn't look edible. It totally is.
Down there you can see Hosta in full flower in a kind of a typical, the kind of place it loves. In the deep shade, it looks beautiful and productive in that kind of environment, despite the fact it's a very dry location. This is an Aquilegia, which the Native Americans are known to have used. We've got this giant here. It's a woodland plant from Japan.
2.5 meters tall.
It's used in Japan in tempura, the young shoots.
Okay.
But I ate some in the springtime and they were delicious.
Nice.
Very young shoots. Not more than about 3 years old. Also an ornamental variation on that particular species. And it's a Parasenecio hastatus variety. Then we've got ornamental sea kale in full flower. Yeah, you can still eat the flowers, but it's mainly the young shoots, and they're best blanched in the springtime, so a bucket over them or something. And that plant there is growing on no more than that much soil. It's quite incredible over rock. Phyllite. This one is more of a curiosity. It's not very tasty. It's an umbellifer carrot family from the mountains in southern Europe, which has been used for food, but not to my taste. It's more of a kind of a dramatic plant. I've left it mainly because the pollinators, so bees and other insects.
This year you're sort of letting a lot of plants go to flower and seed that you wouldn't otherwise have done.
Yeah. So this year, with all the extra time I'm not traveling, I'm devoting a lot of time to try and document what's here.
Yeah.
And I've always had a wish to know. I've always been interested in birds, butterflies, obvious things like that. But this year I've really concentrated on moths. And just within the course of a few months, I've maybe documented about 80 different species of moth in the garden.
Some are extremely beautiful.
Yeah, just astonishing variations, and when you get even the small ones can be really beautiful. You don't really see it until you blow them up. So that's been a real, absolutely fantastic. So I spent an hour this morning. I have a moth trap, light, let them go afterwards, so it's totally harmless. Yeah, just this morning I had about 30 different species in the trap. So, and of course, part of the reason there's such a diversity is because there's such a diversity of food plants, also for the moths in this garden. So it's like a kind of a mini botanical garden. There's mainly farmland around here. Yeah, it's interesting to me to see what this kind of gardening can create as far as it's basically a mini forest, a mini ecosystem, but everything's more or less edible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
This is flowering parsnip, which I'm saving for seed. They're also fantastic for the pollinating insects. In fact, there's although there is one moth that eats the seed, the larvae eat the seeds, and you find kind of cocoons within the seeds, which destroys some of the production. But I don't mind.
No, You've got enough here.
I've got enough, and quite a few species that I've recorded have never been recorded in Trinidad before.
We were talking a little bit about Isabella Tree earlier in her book Wilding. If you allow the right keystone species to show up, then more and more diversity gets attracted to that spot.
Absolutely.
And eventually, over the years, you create a stable ecosystem. And that's definitely what you've got here.
I was showing you earlier my Hablitzia, which grows mostly in the very early spring when there's still enough moisture in the soil. And I get tremendous production in the same place where I couldn't get any potatoes or any of the traditional annual crops. And then I get this plant coming in, which is probably the most foraged wild vegetable in the northern hemisphere. It's one of the hogweeds, or cow parsnips in North America, Heracleum genus. And this is a wild local species, Heracleum sibiricum, which has just sowed itself in this spot. It's grown up, and I've let it grow because it's an edible, so it fits into my... And then I discovered that Hablitzia is using it as a climbing frame.
Perfect companion.
It's pretty dry, the soil here, but once the roots get established, some of the roots go quite a long way. They're really long into the slightly moister soil, because there's not much more soil than that there, which isn't deep enough for Hablitzia roots. So they go sideways instead.
Which is how would they do it in nature as well? I mean, that's their natural habitat, really. Kind of rocky outcrops.
We've seen limestone caves.
It likes rocky areas that are humid. It needs drainage, which it would get automatically in a rocky area.
Probably it likes to have a bit of lime in the soil as well.
Okay.
The source rock phyllite is fairly basic.
And so it's nice for people to know what habitats it thrives in and which ones it doesn't. It doesn't really do well on my farm, which is sort of a silt clay farm. I think it's just...
We'll see it a bit later today at the community garden, which is basically an open field, fairly clay. It's not thrived. When we moved from England to Norway in 1981, we were vegetarians. There really were only a handful of vegetables in the supermarkets. So to survive as vegetarians, we had to start growing on quite a big scale. And the place we rented, we had a big garden. We were allowed to use as much space as we wanted. And then we looked for houses, and we found this place here. And when we moved to Norway, I was very interested in birds and butterflies and all this kind of thing. I like to have the names of things, So I was a bit of a bird watcher in Edinburgh when I was living there as a student. And we found this place here. And there were even more trees than you can see today when we bought the place. And we counted something like 25 bird boxes hung up on all the trees. Wow. So the previous owners had been really interested in birds, and we could see that this was a really great place. Actually, coming to Norway was a big adventure, and I was really excited to see there's so many different birds here to what you get in Denmark or in the UK. So some of the thrushes like redwing and fieldfare are just winter visitors with us. I saw that there was this real potential for this place here, and not really a place you would think of growing vegetables. You think of growing vegetables on a field, lots of sun. Definitely not the case here. We did open it up. There were 3 or 4 birch trees just here, and we felled them to give a bit more light, but at the same time we wanted to keep as many of the trees as possible. I say I have a disease called collectomania, a serious disease, and my dad collects stamps. I had to find something to collect, and it ended up being edible plants. I travelled with my job as an oceanographer. I travelled around the world. We had a big project in the South Pacific, of all places. We were mapping the ocean wave energy as a potential future energy source, that at that time were using mainly diesel as fuel. And which entailed me going down and giving courses in places like Fiji and Rarotonga in the Cook Islands back in the late 80s, early 90s. I should mention also in 1981, when I moved to Trondheim, there was formed a local group of the Norwegian Useful Plant Society, Nyttevækstforeningen, a group of youngsters in their 20s who had been inspired by the Food for Free movement in foraging in the UK and other parts of Europe in the 70s, and started up this local group. And luckily I joined them very early, and I very soon learnt that not only was there an amazing amount of berries and fungi in the woods, but there was also a big diversity of wild edible plants, mainly growing along the shoreline here, where there's a big diversity because of all the different ecological niches that you have, from the salt water where you have the seaweeds to the land, which is a lot of salt as well, making a difference in the composition of the plants which are growing there. I have a list of about 100 botanical species which have been used for food, just growing in this local area here. Today I don't forage. I very rarely get my food from the wild. What I've done is to domesticate a lot of the wild species. In fact, wild species from all over the world. I don't know how many species I have in the garden, but maybe something like 1,500 edible plants. And I know that over the years, I've tried something like 8,000 edible plants on this little rocky hillside. If I can do it, anybody can do it, they say, you know. Particularly, people think of the climate here being really not very good. For me, this is the perfect place in the world to grow food. Of course, we can't grow tomatoes and chilies and what most people think of as vegetables because it's really too cold in the summer, but there are thousands of other things we can grow. When I travelled, I was in the South Pacific. I travelled around the world, and I stopped in other parts of the world, North America, New Zealand, and started buying books on foraging in other parts of the world. And on one trip, I remember in Seattle, I bought a book called Cornucopia 2, a source book of edible plants, which includes descriptions of about 3,000 wild species of plant. And I discovered in this book that actually some of the ornamental plants that I was growing in my garden were actually important food plants in other parts of the world. Hosta, the world's most important ornamental plant, grown mainly for the leaves. There's a bigger one over here, Autumn Moon, and there are something like 10,000 cultivars of hostas. In Japan, this is an important food plant, which is sold in all the supermarkets in the springtime. The leaves of hosta are actually more nutritious than even kale, which we talk about as being the super antioxidants and nutritious leafy green vegetable. And these plants are incredibly robust as well. They will grow anywhere, and they're productive. I call edimentals, edible ornamentals, which is my word I made up to describe this combination. And in recent years, as important has been this thing about pollinators, insects, and conserving insects, the importance of insects. And I particularly, at the moment, I'm kind of trying to catalogue plants which combine being edible, ornamental, and good for the insects. And that's the perfect thing, which I call entomentals. Ento meaning from entomology. Okay, or birds as well. I haven't got a word for that yet. Mental, perhaps, because there are many plants which you can grow. I'm kind of a bit sceptical to the amount of wild food which we put in our gardens, which is often cultivated using chemical agriculture, so sunflower seeds and other seeds which we put out for the birds in the winter. So I try and grow as much of my bird seed as possible by having a diversity of seed-producing plants. And this is a place where, you know, I feel is paradise. You know, it's a huge diversity of insects and birds in a place that most people think of as the Arctic, cold and uninhabitable, you know. In reality, it's this is paradise. Plants that grow best in these shady conditions are perennials. I wrote a book, Around the World in 80 Plants, which came out in 2014, giving an overview of my 80 favourite perennial vegetables, which I grow here. Hosta, of course, is one of the best and most productive, which will even grow on the north side of my house where there's absolutely no direct sunlight. For me, the stories behind the plants are almost as interesting as the taste or the nutrition. If you look at the tree species, there's quite a diversity of tree species. Notably, there is wild hazel growing here. And hazelnuts, as you know, attracts woodpeckers, nuthatches. And one speciality we have here, squirrels, of course, as well. And then there's something called the Siberian nutcracker. You may be lucky to hear that they're around at the moment. In the 1970s, they planted a lot of sembra pine, Pinus sembra, around Trondheim. It was both experimental as a forest plant, but also planted as a kind of an ornamental in the city, in people's gardens. And after 30 years, this species started producing nuts. And it's actually one of the species we also use for pine nuts, which we could buy in the supermarket. They're quite big. So there was this invasion in the early 2000s, and the birds discovered their food plant around Trondheim, and mainly just around Trondheim. Few of them stayed. So we now have a subpopulation of the Siberian nutcracker just around the city here. And they come down to the garden, they're looking to seed. They store the nuts. So they collect them, and the bird has a big pouch under its beak. And they collect a lot of these nuts, and each bird has something like 10 different locations in the forest, which they can locate under the snow in the winter. And of course, in the process of this, they're actually also sowing seed. So that this plant is also spreading. Their food plant, so they're creating a better environment for themselves, and the number of species are increasing. This pine is an invasive plant, but at the same time we've increased the number of bird species by one. So this is Hablitzia, climbing spinach, and one of my most productive perennial vegetables in the garden. So this is 18, 19 seasons old, and it's never had any fertilizer, which is another thing with perennials. They tend to have deeper root systems, and therefore they get sufficient nutrients. They also don't need to be watered, because they're growing most actively in the springtime, when there's usually enough moisture in the soil after a long winter, after the snow melts. We call it stjernemelde in Norwegian, Caucasus spinat. So this came to Scandinavia in the 1870s as an ornamental, and was grown in particularly old gardens. But I think it was outcompeted by clematis and other more flowery climbing plants in about the 1920s. But despite that, some of the old plants survive almost 100 years in old gardens. So it's a very long-lived plant. I had a project for the Norwegian Gene Bank about 10 years ago now, collecting old varieties of this, or making a collection. We found it in about 10 different collections, which went to Norgem as seed. Very, very hardy. Can tolerate -30 in the winter. And nutritionally, this is on the same level as spinach. Doesn't have a particularly high level of oxalic acid, which some people worry about. I don't. You know, many wild plants have, and cultivated plants contain oxalic acid, and oxalic acid actually has a positive function in our bodies, particularly in removing unwanted chemicals. There's actually no evidence that oxalic acid can give you kidney stones, and there's no evidence really that it will worsen that kind of conditions. So whenever I have food for dinner, I generally have at least 20 different leafy green vegetables, okay? So when you have this diversity, then you generally get all your needs and your worries about high oxalic. It kind of balances out. You know? This is what we're programmed. When I first moved here, we created 7 raised beds because there's very little soil on the. Let's have a look at this on the rock. I've made these ditches which go right down to the rock to enable me to both have trees, because the roots take all the water as well. So I wouldn't be able to have such a good yield of perennial vegetables on my beds if I just allowed the trees to do what they wanted to. If you've got deep soil, it's much easier. But of course, they fill in with leaves and things, and I have to clear them out on a regular basis. There are about 40 species of trees and bushes planted along this edge. Over the years, I've added compost. I don't use anything else apart from seaweed. This is a wild species which grows in the wild both above the tree line. In the Alps, for example, you find it both in the forest and out of the forest.
Right.
In the Far East, it's mainly a forest plant. This is Streptopus. You can try a berry. The darker ones are best. It's a North American woodland, and the young shoots are edible as well. Cucumber root.
And this is kind of interesting looking.
That's Smelicina, false Solomon seal, which is also a Native American spring shoot food plant. It grows incredibly well in dry, shady places. I also have an edible house with an indoor forest garden. You've heard of permaculture probably, and forest gardening. Permaculture kind of discovered me rather than vice versa. In the mid-2000s, when there were 3 articles about the garden here in the biggest gardening magazine in Norway, and I started getting visits from permaculturists, and they came in here and said, "Wow, you've got a fantastic forest garden. How did you design this? You know, you're supposed to design in permaculture." And I really had to think, did I design this? Did I? Yeah, I suppose I did in some way. I learnt, and I planted things where they would grow in nature. That was important. So, yeah, there is a kind of design. This garden now is part of the LAND network. I think it stands for Learning and Networking Demonstration Sites across these parts of Europe. In order to get the LAND certification, I had to have a PDC, and I'd never trained in permaculture. So the solution was that we organised a permaculture course here, and I taught myself about the plants. So more or less everything is edible in the garden, but there are a few extremely poisonous plants as well. So that was quite a smart idea, because if suddenly the supermarkets close and everybody knows about this edible garden here, it's a real risk to come and start randomly eating my plants.
Eat at your own risk. Yeah.
We're actually making a sign at the moment, a combined combination of KVANN and KVANN network.